I never imagined that something as simple as decorating a Christmas tree could unravel my life. It was just one evening, a quiet moment during the holiday season. The house was filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon, and the flicker of the fireplace cast a soft glow across the room. It should have been another typical Christmas, the kind I had spent for years with William. But that night, everything changed. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. I replay the events in my mind, wondering if there was a point where I could have stopped it. Was it when Zane handed me the ornament, his fingers grazing mine? Or when we both reached for the same string of lights, laughing as our hands became tangled? Perhaps it was the way his eyes held mine, with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Looking back, the signs were so clear. Small things I ignored, things I didn't want to face. But in that moment, standing so close to Zane, it was as if the world shrank until it was just the two of us, caught in a moment that felt both destined and impossible. William had gone to bed early, as he often did. The years had taken their toll on him, and by 9 p.m., he was usually asleep while I stayed awake. That night, Zane and I stayed behind to finish decorating the tree. The fire crackled, casting shadows across the room, and a soft Christmas song played in the background. It wasn't something I planned. I didn't go into that room thinking I'd cross a line I could never return from. But as the night wore on, as the ornaments found their place and the wine flowed a little too freely, something shifted. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was the way Zane looked at me, not just as his stepmother, but as a woman, someone who had been invisible for too long. Or maybe it was the way I felt around him, alive, seen, and wanted. It wasn't meant to happen, but it did. One moment we were standing too close, our hands brushing as we reached for the same ornament. The next, the air between us felt thick, charged with something unspoken. I should have stopped it. I should have stepped back, laughed it off, gone to bed, and left the moment behind. But I didn't. Since then, I've spent countless nights trying to understand what happened. Was it loneliness, desire, or just a simple mistake? Whatever it was, it set off a chain of events I couldn't control. Now, every Christmas when I see a tree decorated with ornaments and lights, I think of that night. I think of Zane, of what we shared, and how one innocent moment turned into something I will never forget. The holiday season has a way of hiding what's broken, wrapping it in tinsel and lights until it almost appears whole again. That's what I had hoped for. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year, a season that reminded me of better days, but even the most beautiful decorations couldn't hide the cracks in my life. William and I had been married for 15 years. When I first met him, he swept me off my feet with his quiet strength and the stability I needed after my divorce. But over time, that stability started to feel like complacency. William was a good man, but our marriage had become stale. We shared the same house and the same space, but it felt like we were on opposite sides of a wall, neither knowing how to break through. Most nights he fell asleep in his recliner with the TV humming in the background. The spark that once lit up our relationship had faded into something lukewarm, comfortable, but uninspiring. I told myself that this was just how marriages evolved and that I should be grateful for what we had. But gratitude didn't fill the emptiness inside me. Then Zane came home. Zane, William's son from his first marriage, hadn't lived with us since he was a teenager. When William and I married, Zane was already 18 and eager to leave home. I only saw him during occasional holiday visits or brief family gatherings, and even then, he kept his distance. At 28, Zane was no longer the boy I remembered. He had grown into a man, confident, self-assured, with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. He had been working as a graphic designer in the city, but when his company downsized, he decided to return to our small town for the holidays. "It's just temporary," he told William over the phone. "I'll be gone by January." William welcomed him home without hesitation, eager to reconnect with his son. For me, Zane's return was both a surprise and a challenge. I hadn't expected him to stay for a month, and I certainly hadn't expected his presence to disrupt the routine I had come to rely on. From the moment he arrived, Zane brought a new energy to the house. He wasn't loud or overbearing, but he had a way of filling the space, drawing attention without trying. He was thoughtful, quick-witted, and surprisingly kind, noticing things that William often overlooked. "You're really going all out this year," Zane remarked one evening as he watched me hang garlands along the staircase. "It's tradition," I replied, shrugging. "I like to make the house feel festive." He smiled, his eyes warm. "You do a good job of it. It's nice to come back to something that feels like home." His words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to compliments anymore, especially ones that felt genuine. The days leading up to Christmas were busy, filled with the usual hustle and bustle. William spent most of his time running errands or catching up with friends, leaving Zane and me to handle the decorations. I threw myself into the work, determined to make everything perfect. Zane was surprisingly helpful, unpacking boxes of ornaments, untangling strings of lights, and even climbing onto the roof to hang the outdoor decorations. We worked side by side, and though the tasks were mundane, they felt lighter with him there. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old ornaments, we came across a dusty ceramic angel with one chipped wing. "I remember this," Zane said, holding it up. "Mom loved this angel." I paused, unsure how to respond. Zane's mother was a subject we rarely discussed, a ghost lingering in the background of our family. "She said it brought good luck," he continued, smiling wistfully. "Do you think that's true?" I hesitated. Maybe it brought her comfort. Sometimes that's all we need. He nodded and placed the angel carefully on the mantel. As the days passed, I found myself noticing things about Zane I hadn't before. The way his smile lit up a room, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It wasn't just that he was attractive, though he was. It was the way he made me feel seen, appreciated, like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into his gestures and words. But there were moments that made me question everything, like when we both reached for the same strand of lights, our hands brushing against each other, or when his gaze lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years, and it terrified me. The Christmas tree was always the centerpiece of our holiday decorations, and this year was no exception. William insisted on getting the biggest tree we could fit in the living room, hauling it inside with Zane's help while I set up the stand. By the time the tree was in place, William was ready to call it a night. "You two can handle the decorations," he said, yawning. "I'm beat." Zane and I exchanged a look, both smiling at William's predictability. "Good night," I said as he headed upstairs, leaving us alone in the glow of the fireplace. We worked together in silence at first, hanging ornaments and stringing lights. The fire crackled softly, and a light snow began to fall outside, the flakes visible through the large window behind the tree. "This reminds me of when I was a kid," Zane said, breaking the silence. "Decorating the tree?" I asked. He nodded. "It was always a big deal. Mom would bake cookies and we'd stay up late hanging ornaments. She'd always let me put the star on top." I smiled. "Sounds like a nice tradition." "It was," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't think I'd miss it, but being here, it's nice." His words stirred something in me, a warmth I hadn't felt in years. The evening wore on, and the space between us seemed to shrink with every ornament we hung. We laughed at old memories, shared stories, and for a moment I forgot about the weight of my marriage, the years of feeling unseen. Zane handed me a glass ornament shaped like a snowflake, his fingers brushing mine as he passed it over. The touch was brief but electric, sending a shiver through me. "You okay?" he asked, his tone soft. "Yeah," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. But I wasn't okay. Something was shifting between us, something I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. The tree was nearly finished when Zane climbed the ladder to place the star on top. As he reached up, the ladder wobbled slightly, and I instinctively reached out to steady it. "Careful," I said, my voice tight. He laughed, glancing down at me. "I've got it." When he stepped down, we were standing close. Too close. I could feel the heat of his body, the scent of pine and something faintly citrusy clinging to him. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Grace," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at him, my heart racing. "Zane, The words caught in my throat, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. The night had taken on a dreamlike quality, the living room illuminated by the soft glow of the Christmas tree, ornaments shimmering like tiny jewels, and the fire crackling warmly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Zane stood close, his height towering over me, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. "I should put the rest of these away," I said, gesturing to the box of leftover ornaments. My voice sounded strained, unconvincing even to myself. Zane didn't move. His eyes searched mine, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on us. "You don't have to keep running, Grace," he said softly, his tone almost teasing but with an edge of seriousness. "I'm not running," I said, though the tremble in my hands betrayed me. "You are." He leaned against the back of the couch, folding his arms. "I've seen it ever since I got here. The way you keep yourself busy, always finding something to do, but you never stop." His words hit too close to home, stirring something I wasn't ready to confront. I busied myself with the ornaments, pretending to organize them even though they didn't need it. "Why do you care?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. Zane hesitated, then stepped closer. "Because I see you, Grace," he said, his voice quieter now. "And I don't think anyone else does." My breath caught in my chest. It wasn't the words themselves, but the sincerity behind them. I hadn't been seen, not really seen, in years. William loved me in his way, but his attention was fleeting, his focus always elsewhere. And now here was Zane, standing before me, saying the words I hadn't even realized I needed to hear. I tried to brush past him, the box of ornaments clutched tightly in my hands, but Zane caught my wrist gently. "Wait," he said, his touch warm and firm. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Talk to me," he urged. "Tell me what's really going on." "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, refusing to meet his gaze. "That's not true," he replied, stepping closer. "You're not happy. I see it every time you look at him, every time you try to fill the silence with something else." "Zane, this isn't your concern," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe not," he said, his voice low, "but I can't ignore it. I can't ignore you." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I felt the tension between us like a taut wire ready to snap. I should have walked away. I should have told him to stop. But instead, I stood there, my feet rooted to the floor, my mind swirling with emotions I couldn't control. It happened so quickly, yet it felt inevitable. One moment, we were standing too close, his hand still lightly holding my wrist. The next, his lips were on mine, soft and searching. For a heartbeat, I didn't move, too stunned to process what was happening. But then something inside me broke free, the part of me that had been longing for connection, for passion, for someone to make me feel alive again. I kissed him back. The box of ornaments slipped from my hands, forgotten as I reached up to touch his face. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment the only thing that existed was him, the warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, the way he made me feel like the only person in the world. But then reality crashed down around me. I pulled away, my breathing unsteady, and took a step back. "Zane, we can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "Why not?" he asked, his tone steady but filled with emotion. "Because it's wrong," I said, shaking my head. "You're William's son. I'm his wife. This, whatever this is It can't happen." Zane looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Determination, perhaps, or maybe defiance. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. "But tell me this. Did it feel wrong to you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I fled to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I leaned against the counter, my mind racing, replaying the kiss over and over again. What had I done? How had I let it get this far? Zane didn't follow me, and for that, I was grateful. I needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out how to fix what had just happened. But even as the guilt settled over me like a heavy weight, I couldn't ignore the other feeling. The way my heart had leapt when he kissed me, the way I'd felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I stayed up late that night, unable to sleep. William was snoring softly in the bedroom, completely unaware of the chaos that had unfolded downstairs. I sat by the fire, staring at the flames, feeling torn about what I had done. When Zane finally came downstairs, he said nothing. He simply took a seat across from me in the armchair, his presence a quiet reminder of everything that had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked after a long silence. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Zane leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Grace, I'm sorry if I crossed a line. I didn't mean to." "You didn't," I interrupted, surprising myself. "It's not your fault, Zane. I should have stopped it before it started." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" I hesitated, the question cutting deeper than I had expected. "I don't know," I said finally. "I don't know what to feel right now." We didn't speak about the kiss again after that night, but everything between us had changed. Every glance, every touch seemed charged with an energy that I couldn't ignore. I told myself it had been a mistake, a moment we both regretted and would move past. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, as we continued decorating, Zane caught my eye and smiled. It was a small gesture, subtle enough to be unnoticed by William, but it sent a thrill through me nonetheless. I knew I was playing with fire. I knew this was reckless, dangerous, and wrong, but for the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't ignore, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I thought the kiss by the Christmas tree would be the end of it. A mistake, a moment of weakness we'd both regret. But the days that followed proved me wrong. Zane and I didn't speak of it, but the silence between us was thick with unspoken words. Every glance felt like a secret, every touch lingered a little too long, and every word seemed to carry more weight than it should. William, unaware of the shift, spent his days running errands or working in his office. He was finalizing plans for his fishing trip in January, a yearly tradition he looked forward to. "You and Zane have everything under control here," he said one evening, laughing without realizing what was really going on. I hated myself for how I felt when William left us alone, but I couldn't deny the thrill that came with Zane's presence. The way his gaze followed me when he thought no one was watching, the way his voice softened whenever he spoke my name. The first crack in my resolve came the morning after our kiss. I was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for Christmas cookies, trying desperately to focus on anything other than the memory of Zane's kiss. The snow was falling softly outside, blanketing the world in white, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the heater. "Morning," Zane said as he walked in, his voice warm and casual. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes on the counter. "Making cookies?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. "It's tradition," I said, trying to keep my tone brisk. "William likes them fresh for Christmas Eve." Zane didn't reply right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the room in a way that made my heart race. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his voice low. "I'm not," I said, though I knew he could hear the lie in my voice. He leaned against the counter beside me, his arm brushing mine. "You don't have to feel guilty, Grace," he said. I froze, my hands stilling in the dough. How could I not? "I don't regret it," he said, his gaze steady, "and I don't think you do either." His words hung in the air, challenging me to respond, but I didn't. Instead, I turned back to my work, my hands trembling as I shaped the dough. It happened again that afternoon. William had gone to town to buy a few last-minute gifts, leaving Zane and me alone in the house. I was in the living room hanging stockings over the fireplace when he entered. "Need help?" he asked, his tone light. "I've got it," I said, though the stocking hook slipped from my fingers as I spoke. Zane caught it before it hit the floor, his reflexes quick. He handed it back to me, his hand brushing mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a shiver through me. "Grace," he said softly, stepping closer. I shook my head, my voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said, but his voice betrayed him. "I can't stop thinking about you." "Zane, please," I whispered. But even as I said the words, I felt my resolve crumble. And then he kissed me again. The next encounter came during a snowstorm when William was out at a Christmas party, hosted by an old college friend. The snow fell heavily and the wind howled outside as Zane and I worked together to check on the barn. William mentioned the generator might need fuel, Zane said as he zipped up his coat. "I'll help," I said, eager for an excuse to leave the house and clear my head. The barn was cold, the scent of hay and wood lingering in the air. We worked in silence at first, filling the generator and checking on the supplies William kept there. But as the wind howled outside, I felt Zane's gaze on me. The tension between us seemed to grow with each passing moment. "This feels like one of those Christmas movies," he said, breaking the silence. I laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" "Two people stuck together in a snowstorm, the whole world shut out." He smiled, his tone teasing, but his eyes were serious. I began to respond, but he stepped closer, cutting me off. "Tell me you don't feel it, too," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know what I feel," I admitted, my breath visible in the cold air. He reached for me then, his hand brushing against my cheek. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he said, "but I can't ignore this. I can't ignore you." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. And then, against all reason, I leaned into him, allowing him to pull me close. The most reckless moment came on Christmas Eve. While William was out delivering gifts to the neighbors, Zane and I were in the kitchen preparing dinner. I was at the counter slicing vegetables when he walked up behind me. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice low. "I'm trying to focus," I said, though my hands trembled. "On what?" he asked, stepping closer. "On getting through this without making a mess of everything." "You already have," he said with a faint smile. "And so have I." I set the knife down, my shoulders slumping. "Zane, this has to stop." He reached for me, his hand brushing mine. "Does it?" he said softly. "Yes," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. But when he kissed me, I didn't stop him. The more it happened, the harder it became to hide. My best friend Laura started to notice the change in me. "You've been glowing lately," she said one afternoon as we sat in the living room sipping tea. "Glowing?" I repeated, laughing nervously. "Don't play dumb, Grace," she said with a smirk. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I said quickly, too quickly. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "I know that look. Just be careful, okay? Whatever it is, don't let it ruin you." Her words stayed with me long after she left. The tension reached its peak on Christmas night. The three of us sat in the living room, the fire crackling and the Christmas lights glowing softly. William was dozing in his chair, the remnants of dinner still scattered on the table. Zane and I exchanged a glance, and in that moment, everything felt exposed, too fragile. Later, when William went to bed, Zane found me in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said, his voice serious. "Zane, I can't do this anymore," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking, "but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this." His words shattered what little resolve I had left. The weight of what Zane and I had done pressed heavily on me. That Christmas night, the world outside was silent, the snow piling softly against the windows. But inside, my thoughts were anything but quiet. Zane's words still echoed in my mind. I can't keep pretending I don't feel this. I wanted to believe we could stop, that this would be the last time we'd let our feelings get the better of us. But every glance, every touch, made it harder to pull away. The first real crack in our secret came from Linda, our overly attentive neighbor. She'd been stopping by more frequently, ostensibly to drop off baked goods or check on William's health. But her sharp eyes lingered too long, and her questions always seemed to skirt around Zane and me. "Zane's certainly been keeping busy around here," she remarked one morning, her gaze flitting between the two of us as we stood in the kitchen. "He's been a big help with the decorations," I replied, forcing a smile. Linda hummed thoughtfully. "I suppose it's nice to have him back for a while. A handsome young man like that must be a magnet for attention, though. I bet the ladies in town are thrilled." Her words made my stomach churn. It wasn't what she said. It was the way she said it, her tone edged with knowing curiosity. "Zane's focused on his next career move," I said, trying to redirect the conversation. "Of course," Linda said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Still, it's good he has family to lean on." I could feel Zane stiffen beside me, his jaw tightening. When Linda finally left, the tension between us was palpable. "She knows something," Zane said, his voice low. "No, she doesn't," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure. Just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, Harper arrived, William's daughter from his second marriage. She was younger than Zane by 5 years and had always been fiercely protective of her father. Harper's sharp intuition was her defining trait, and I knew it wouldn't take her long to notice the tension between Zane and me. The first evening Harper spent with us, her questions were subtle but sharp, cloaked in politeness. "You and Zane seem to be getting along well," she said as we cleaned up after dinner. "He's been helpful," I replied, keeping my tone light. "It's been nice having him here." Her eyes lingered on me for a moment before she smiled. "Dad's lucky to have you. Not many people would go all out like this for Christmas." I forced a laugh. "It's just tradition." But I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. The breaking point came 2 nights later. William had gone to bed early again, and Harper was out visiting an old friend. Zane and I were in the living room, the tree still glowing softly in the background. He sat too close, and though I knew it was dangerous, I couldn't bring myself to move away. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "So have you," I replied, not meeting his gaze. "I don't want this to end," he admitted, his hand brushing against mine. "Zane, we're going to get caught," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Then let's be careful," he said, as though it were that easy. I opened my mouth to argue, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs froze us both. Harper appeared in the doorway, her expression cautious. "What are you two doing?" she asked. "Just talking," I said quickly, pulling my hand back. Harper's eyes narrowed as they darted between us. "It's late. Don't you think you should be heading to bed, Zane?" He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he stood up. "Good night," he said, his voice calm but tense. When he was gone, Harper turned to me. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Nothing," I said, though my heart was racing. "Don't lie to me, Grace," she said, her voice firm. "I know Zane, and I know when something's off. If you're doing anything to hurt my dad—" "I'm not," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "Harper, you're reading too much into this." Her eyes stayed on me for a long moment before she finally nodded. "I hope you're right." That conversation was the wake-up call I hadn't realized I needed. For days after that, I avoided Zane, throwing myself into housework and errands, anything to keep from being alone with him. He tried to talk to me, but I refused to engage, knowing that every word would pull me deeper into something I couldn't escape. On New Year's Eve, William announced that Zane had decided to leave earlier than planned. "He says he's ready to get back to work," William said cheerfully over dinner. I forced a smile, my chest tightening. "That's good," I said, keeping my voice steady. Later that night, Zane found me in the kitchen. "You don't have to shut me out like this," he said, his voice pained. "It's better this way," I said, not meeting his gaze. "Better for who?" he asked, stepping closer. "For everyone," I said, my voice firm. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "If that's what you want." "It is," I whispered, though my heart ached as I said the words. The morning Zane left, the house felt unbearably quiet. William and Harper waved him off cheerfully, completely unaware of the weight of his absence. I watched from the window as his car disappeared down the snowy driveway, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. Looking back now, I can see that moment for what it was, a collision of loneliness, longing, and desire that could never be sustained. I let myself believe in something fleeting, something that could never last, and it nearly cost me everything. William never found out, and Harper, if she suspected, kept her thoughts to herself. But the guilt stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I came to losing the life I had built. Do I regret it? Some days, yes. But other days, I remember the way Zane made me feel. Alive, wanted, and seen. And I wonder if it was worth the price. Now, whenever I see a Christmas tree, I think of that night. The lights, the warmth, the promise of something new, and the weight of everything I left behind.